VikesNow, I am Dustin Baker. It is the August 8th edition. Preseason game is 2 nights away. Remember, that game starts late. So it's in Seattle, West Coast. So if you're going to tune into NFL Network, show up on your sofa or bed at 9 p.m. Yesterday, we went through some of the surprises and takeaways from the initial depth chart release. And an interesting point of order, I tweeted this last night, that when the Vikings, under this coaching staff, released the depth chart last year, only 2 of the starters ended up not starting. So there's a lot of, this is just an initial depth chart. That's what the coaching staff is saying. That's what some fans are saying. And I get it. It's probably very fluid. But last year, Jesse Davis was penciled in as the right guard. He was traded. Ed Ingram ended up being the starter. And then Armon Watts was penciled in as a starter last year, and he was mysteriously waived 3 weeks later. So last year, the depth chart, that was a pretty good indicator. So we shall see if that holds true. But what I want to do is completely change topics. I think tomorrow we'll talk with Josh Fry about more of the depth chart implications. But I want to go through some of my hot takes for the Vikings 2023 season. You will determine, you guys and gals, how hot these takes indeed are. But I want to roll through them. I don't have them ranked in any particular order. But let's start with them. The first one, number 1, Dustin's first hot take of the Vikings 2023 season, is that they will not necessarily duel the Lions for first place. Instead, they will look in the rear view or look in front of them and see the Packers. I think it'll be same old, even without Aaron Rodgers on the cheese team. Why do I think that? Well, I think I know there is a lot of steam about the Lions finally doing the thing and winning a playoff game for the first time in 3 decades. Great. If they can pull that off, wonderful. They've always been the little brother to the Vikings, and I have no ill will toward the Lions. I have had no reason to. Because anytime they played Stafford and the gang, I was always like, that guy's pretty good, but they ain't going to do much. So I think you're like me. I've never had any big beef with the Lions like I do the Packers and, of course, Bears. What I do know is this offseason there's been tremendous momentum, positivity, and optimism about these Lions. And if you Google NFC North predictions, almost every single one of them is going to have the Lions winning the division at about 10-7 or 11-6. They are the darling league-wide to finally spring up and do something worth a damn. And again, good for them. But I am still flummoxed. I think they should live in this camp of believe it when you see it. I know Jared Goff had a great year, but I also know that Jared Goff that was left for dead in Los Angeles, and nobody really cared when, what was a playoff game in 2020 or 2021? No, 2020, when he was injured. And I think they were going to start Johnny Wolford. And Rams fans, the NFL media was like, okay. Nobody cared that Goff was hurt that playoff game. It was like it was not a big deal that he was going to miss, or there wasn't a big variance between starting Johnny Wolford. I digress. I'm also concerned about the Lions' defense for them. I've said on this show multiple times that even when they got good last year after their 1-6 start, the defense never really improved. If you look at any metric and sort it by like week 12 to week 18, the defense still lived right down there with your Minnesota Vikings. So I think we kind of believe there was this Lions renaissance on defense, and it really never happened. And they have the same defensive coordinator. Of course, they added C.J. Johnson and Cameron Sutton. So they got some names. But on the Lions, generally speaking, I think that because they were on Hard Knocks last year, everybody that watched that program felt like they had an intimate seat to this blossoming project known as the Lions, and therefore it's almost like it's like one of your family members. It's like your cousin, like, oh, I can't wait to see these guys finally do great. I got to watch them for blah, blah, blah number of episodes, and they're really going to break out. And they got this head coach that we love to death. Great. Show me it first. Last year when they started 1-6, and then they rectified it by, did they end up going 8-9 or something like that? 1-6 starting a season is still pretty shitty. And who's to say they won't start that way again? They play the Chiefs right out of the gate. And it's, a nasty prognosis for any team out of the gate. But I just think the Packers are still structurally sound. I don't think Jordan Love is going to be horrible. I don't care what his family night practice suggest. I still think that the Packers will be there in the mix at 9-8 or so, and the Lions will probably be there at 8-9. That's what I'm feeling right now. Happy to be proven wrong, and it's not the Packers. It'd be great if the Packers were, 6-11. What we don't want to have happen is what Thor Nystrom said on the show a couple months ago. You don't want the Packers to be bad enough that they enter the Caleb Williams sweepstakes, because, of course, that would be something that would happen to them, and bada bing, you as the Vikings fan and me as the Vikings fan would have to deal with him for the next 10 to 15 years. So you want the Packers to struggle, but you don't want them to go like 3-14 or some shit, because then they'll be in the Caleb Williams or Drake May sweepstakes. Yuck. All right, so my first hot take is that the Vikings, I predict them to win the division. I haven't decided on 10-7 or 11-6 yet as my record prediction, but I believe the Packers will be nipping at their heels, not the Lions, and the Bears will be marinating back at about 6-11 or 7-10 or something like that. Number 2, no matter what happens in terms of statistics, vibes, or production, this will be KJ Osborne's final year with the Vikings. Get your tissues out. This man is entering the final year of his rookie contract. And that, what I believe he's doing, and of course he's the ultimate team guy and clutch playmaker. All the guy does is help the Vikings win games or the greatest comeback in NFL history. But I think if he shows up to 2023, grabs 70 catches for 1,150 yards and 7 touchdowns, I don't think that that's going to have him stay with the Vikings, because they won't be able to afford that. Let's say he puts that stat line together, over 1,000 yards, 7-8 touchdowns, which he's usually good for. He's going to be able to fetch at least $15 million on the open market next free agency, and maybe even more. Now, if he has his typical stat line, which was 700 yards and 5 or 6 touchdowns, then he'll get a more modest contract. But either way, I don't believe it'll be with the Vikings. I believe this is KJ Osborne's final year in purple, and the only reason I have this theory is because the Vikings drafted Jordan Addison with first-round draft capital. He already looks special. He already looks dazzling in training camp. They're going to, almost like they did for Laquan Treadwell, they're going to give him every attempt to be the WR2. Now, Treadwell, they've kept that experiment going way too long, but for Addison, if he arrives to week 1, week 2, week 3, and looks like the real deal, they're going to, throw a party that, all right, we nailed this draft pick. Now he's the WR2 with the Vikings. And that leaves Osborne next March contemplating, okay, do I want to be a WR3 with the Vikings? Or do I want to go, maybe make some WR1 or WR2 money with somebody else? And I think it will be the latter beyond the shadow of a doubt. And it's only because Addison is on this roster. They're going to remain with Addison for at least 4 years with the 5th-year rookie option, and he was picked to be the Vikings' WR2 next to Justin Jefferson, which unfortunately for Osborne's sake left him as the odd man out. Now, you just so happen to have this final year of his contract where you can have all 3, and you can do your best to emulate the 3 deep when I was a teenager. So Osborne, final year with the Vikings. You heard it here. I don't think it was first. I think a lot of folks think that, but I'm putting it on record almost as a guarantee that he won't be a Viking next year. I'd love to be wrong, but we shall see. The next one is that the Vikings defense, diminished of experience, said goodbye to Patrick Peterson, Dalvin Tomlinson, Duke Shelley, Eric Kendricks. They said goodbye to a lot of folks. I think that the defense is going to be pretty good and not just not horrible. I think what we've clamored for this offseason, because they finished 13-4 with an abysmal defense, is, kind of like we always say about the offensive line, just don't suck and let's see what happens. Well, I think with Brian Flores in charge, with all of these youngsters, with the speed, the hunger, the aggressiveness, I think the defense is going to be pretty good. And by pretty good, if you want to use a points allowed or yards allowed metric, I'm thinking like 13th, 14th, 15th, something like that. Now, more realistic, when you go from the bottom of the barrel, they ranked 30th in points allowed, 31st in yards allowed, and I think 27th in DVOA. A reasonable expectation would be like, all right, let's see if we can be 20th best or 19th best. I think they're actually going to be pretty good. Now, this doesn't mean they're going to transform in 1 year to a top 5 unit or a top 10, kind of like the Cowboys did. You might recall in 2020, the Cowboys had a really stinky defensive season. Their offseason consisted of getting Dan Quinn as defensive coordinator and drafting Micah Parsons. And bada bing, that fixed it to the tune of a top 5 defense. Now, the Vikings won't be quite that good, but I don't think that they're going to, live in the 20s for points allowed. I think they're going to be middle of the road in that, 13th, 14th, 15th best tier. And I think that will excite you because that would mean you got a good year of coaching under Flores, and then if he stays, doesn't take a head coaching job next coaching cycle, it can climb even better. So I think I know we've had this request as Vikings fans to say, well, we don't want bend but don't break anymore, and we want the defense to not let Daniel Jones march up and down the field like Tom Brady. I think you're going to get that and more. I think it's going to be a decent defense and not just one that feels a little bit improved from 2022. All right, let's get real funky with the next one. This is number 4, the second to last one on the episode today. I think, and this is not based on intel from any sources or anything, I think the Vikings will actually sign Ndamukong Suh. I thought that before James Lynch got hurt, and now I really think it. Why do I think it? Well, they flirted with the idea last year. I think USA Today reporter Tyler Dragon is his name, in June of last summer, so 14 months ago, tweeted that the Raiders and the Vikings were interested in Ndamukong Suh, but the Vikings eventually couldn't meet at a price point. Suh eventually joined the Eagles, went to a Super Bowl, lost to the Chiefs, and he said this summer that he doesn't have any interest in joining any training camps, but I will show up to play in 2023. Now, I don't know if that will be right away in September, or he's going to wait to see the lay of the land, who's a playoff contender. But I think the Vikings' interior defensive line is screaming for somebody like Suh. Now, he's getting up there in age. He's probably on his way to the Hall of Fame. If you look at it, you got Kyrus Tonga at nose tackle, who's probably going to keep that job. Dean Lowry for the Packers, decent starter, nothing too special. But the depth after those gentlemen is Jonathan Bullard, Ross Blacklock. James Lynch is now hurt. Asazi from the Gophers. I think this is a perfect spot for Ndamukong Suh to live. And, after all, the Vikings finished 13-4 last year. You can convince them that we're contending for a division. Hey, we want to go win a Super Bowl finally. I think that the Vikings, especially because they had free agent interest last year, that the roster right now is tailor-made for somebody with experience just like Suh. And the word we hear attached to this new Flores defense all offseason is aggression. You would be hard-pressed, for better or worse, to find somebody who's more aggressive than Ndamukong Suh throughout modern NFL history. Almost to the point of being dirty as a young player. So I predict, based on zero intel from sources, friends, anybody like that, my theory is the Vikings will end up signing Ndamukong Suh. How's that for a hot take? All right, my last one is really shooting for the stars. When the schedule came out in May, you looked down at it, I looked down at it, we knew it was coming. The Vikings play Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, Jalen Hurts and the Eagles, yuck, Joe Burrow and the Bengals late in the season, and in between all that, Justin Herbert and the Chargers. So they're playing this absolute murderer's row of quarterback, Mahomes, Hurts, Burrow, and Herbert. My hot take is that the Vikings finish at least 2-2 or perhaps 3-1 against that group of quarterbacks. I don't have a good rah-rah speech about why this team is so awesome, baby, and they're gonna do the thing. But I can feel in my bones that the Vikings' typical, recently historical problems with quarterbacks are usually just asshole backup quarterbacks that nobody's ever heard of and then finally have a career day against the Vikings. Unusually under Mike Zimmer, he didn't have a whole lot of struggles with the titans of industry quarterbacks. Aaron Rodgers was, about 500. His Packers were about 500 against the Vikings while Zimmer was in charge. Now, of course, Zimmer doesn't work here anymore. But Brian Flores is a Zimmer-like defensive coordinator in the sense that that's his baby. He's going to scheme for all these dudes, no matter how good they are, specifically to keep the Vikings in games. So I'm not sure which games they'll win. If I'm going to say 3-1, it pretty much means they probably only lose. Who's on the road? The Eagles. I still don't love that matchup, mainly because of the memory is still fresh from last year when they got shellacked. But here's what I'm saying. They're the Vikings against those big four, Mahomes, Hurts, Burrow, Herbert. The Vikings will be 3-1 or 2-2 against those 4 opponents. And the implication there is that the Vikings would be pretty good. If they can slay those 4 dudes, that means at least an 11-6 record is incoming, because I can't really see them, struggling too much against the Lions and the Bears and the Packers. We shall see. From head to toe, it is that the Vikings will contend with the Packers for the NFC North. The Lions won't quite be there. Lions will nibble at 8-9 or 9-8 once again. KJ Osborne sadly plays his final year with the Vikings in 2023. Under Brian Flores, the Vikings defense is actually pretty good. We've set the expectation is just don't be shitty, sir. It's going to be better than shitty. It's going to be pretty good. They will sign Ndamukong Suh. That's my 4th hot take. And the last one is against the murderer's row of quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, and Justin Herbert. The Vikings will either go 3-1 or 2-2 against those 4 teams and passers. All right, we'll be back with Josh Fry tomorrow to unpack more of this depth chart stuff. That's all I got for today. Skol, baby.